This video will continue on talking about descriptive research strategies that we find in Chapter 13. This one in particular will discuss survey studies. So just to remind you of the two that we've talked about already in previous videos, observational studies and content analysis and archival data. Now we're going to cover surveys. So a research study that uses a survey is looking to obtain a description of a particular group of individuals. So a common application is when companies want to give a description of their customers so that they can have a better idea of what their customers want. So these surveys are going to involve questionnaires and or interviews that ask people about their experiences, their attitudes, or their opinions. We see surveys surrounding us in the news, in magazines, on the internet, but we need to make sure that the survey was done properly and that most important, that we have a representative sample. So the goal of a survey is to obtain a snapshot of the group at a particular time, and the results describe variables that are being studied. Now we're going to talk about types of survey questions, and one type of question would be an open-ended question. This is where you introduce a topic and you allow the participants to just have a free response. So for example, how does this picture make you feel? Another type of a question is restricted question. So restricted question is where you present a limited number of response alternatives for the individual. So here's an example, just a survey form example. Which of the following best describes your occupation? And then they have choices that they have to provide. A third type is a rating scale question. So a rating scale question is going to require a selection of a numerical value on some sort of predetermined scale. So here's one example. And so this is the idea is, they answer the question, I feel calm, and then they have these various responses that they can give. I feel secure, the various responses that they can give. So they're rating how they feel, and it's going to give a quantitative number. And here's another example. It's a Likert type scale. And so where participants are going to answer that they either strongly disagree to strongly agree. And here, like the question would be, I have a natural talent for mathematics. Strongly disagree to strongly agree. I'm a good math student. Strongly disagree to strongly agree. And the tendency is called a response set. Now, to get around the problem that sometimes people just kind of pick the neutral statement, is to try to have a mixture of alternate phrasing for the same item, so that you're phrasing things in both a positive statement and a negative statement, so that hopefully you get a real feeling for what their answers are. There's some guidelines for constructing a survey, and one of them is that demographic questions should stick to the end. Really, the reason for this is they're considered boring. So you don't want to put them at the beginning and throw people off, and they don't want to answer the rest of your questionnaire. Sensitive questions should be kept to the middle. You don't want to, again, throw them off at the beginning, and you don't want them to be, oh, this questionnaire is so long, I don't want to answer these important sensitive questions at the end. So anything that might cause embarrassment or discomfort should be placed in the middle. So by the time the participants encounter these items, they're more likely to have kind of warmed up to the topic, and they'll just answer them because they've already answered so many other things. Group questions that have the same general topic. So if you're asking demographic questions, put them all together. Rating scale questions should be grouped together. So the type of response that you're asking for, group those types of questions together as well to kind of help the flow of the survey. The format should be relatively simple. It should be easy for them to proceed, to answer the questions. They shouldn't really need to ask you any questions about the survey. You don't want to cram the page with too many questions. You want it to be relatively straightforward and simple and easy for them to complete. So vocabulary and language style should be easy to understand. So if your population of interest and who's going to be taking the survey, if they're college level students, you can write at a college level. However, if you're who's going to be taking your survey, if they're elementary school children, you would probably have to write at a slightly different level. Next, we're going to talk about selecting our samples. Who are our participants? We want to make sure that the questions are relevant to our participants. They're not going to want to answer the questions if they don't pertain to them at all. You also want to make sure that your participant selection isn't too restricted. You don't want to, if you're asking a survey about people's views on Trump, you don't want it to only be Democrats, right? You don't want to restrict your participant pool too much. And that's because you want to have what's called a representative sample. So a representative sample is a group of subjects selected from the population of study, which matches the population on important characteristics such as age and sex. Now, sometimes in order to select a representative sample, now you may need to consult professional help. So big companies, when they need to make sure they have a representative sample and that their survey is well put together, they call on someone to help them prepare a survey and identify participants. So now we're going to talk about different ways to administer a survey. And one way is via the internet, and this is what you're going to be doing with your experiments. The benefit of having the internet is that it's efficient to administer to a large number of individuals. You get access to a large number of individuals with common characteristics. The survey can be individualized based on the participants' responses. However, the sample may not be representative. You might have something called non-response bias. Why do some people respond and others don't? And you can't control the composition of your sample. Another way to administer a survey is through the mail. Now, these are really convenient. They're anonymous. You mail the survey out, they mail it back. It's non-threatening. It's easy to administer. However, again, who's going to respond? It can be really expensive. You could mail out 100, and you may only get 10 or 20 responses back. That's about a 10 to 20% response rate is what's fairly typical. So again, we have that non-response bias that could occur, and you're not necessarily sure who completes the survey and why. Telephone surveys are another way. So I know I've gotten phone calls before where someone calls me up and says, "Hey, would you have a moment? Can I have a moment of your time?" They can be conducted from a home or an office. Participants can stay at home or their office, so it's convenient in terms of location. However, it's time consuming. So I know for me, I don't answer the call unless I know who it is. So if you're doing a phone survey in this day and age, you could call a lot of numbers before you actually get someone to call you. And since you're doing it verbally, now there's a potential for interviewer bias. And then in-person surveys and interviews. So they're efficient to administer with a group. So if you had a large group of individuals and you just stood up in the front of the room and you read out the questions to them and they responded, you have a 100% response rate because they're there and they're going to give that information back to you. But they're time consuming, especially if you're doing an individual interview. A group interview or group type of setting, not so bad, but when you have a one-on-one type of interview, that's time consuming if you want to get a good sample size. So here's a summary of some of those strengths and weaknesses that I mentioned when we were going through those different types or different ways to administer a survey. So feel free, I believe this is in your textbook as well, so feel free to look over it and help you understand the strengths and weaknesses of the different survey types.